Chapter 24. What is one of your favorite trips that you've taken? What made it great? I have been very lucky to have taken many wonderful vacation trips. There have been family trips with Joni, like our honeymoon cruise. There have been many trips that Joni and I have taken with Dave and Michelle, like the one to Hawaii and the one to the Keys on the houseboat. And there have been ones that included Ben and Marilyn, like the Disney cruise and the RV trip to Washington State. And there was one with just Dave to the Boundary Waters. Yes, there have been many wonderful and exciting vacation trips with family. And there have been many great and exciting trips that I've taken having to do with business. Taking trips to places all around the country is great, and having them paid for by your employer is a great too. I started my job at Bone in 1968 in an entry-level position. I was a hard-working employee for 25 years. During that time, I worked my way up the ladder to a position just under the president of the division as his special projects manager. I am very proud to have worked my way to this level. This was not only an opportunity to advance, but also to see the country on their nickel. I'd like to give you an idea of some of these business trips, starting with my first trip on an airplane. Our company had 5 manufacturing plants, 2 in Illinois, 1 in Michigan, 1 in California, and 1 in Canada. Bone also had a twin-engine plane based out of Danville to help with travel between these plants, although not many trips were made to the West Coast and Canadian plants. This was a Beechcraft Queen Air, twin-engine, 5-passenger plane. We always had a pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit. My first trip was to our plant in Beardstown, Illinois, which was about a 1-hour flight. We took off from Vermilion County Airport in the morning. There were a couple of other co-workers with me on this trip. I was pretty excited to be on my first flight in a plane, but I was also pretty nervous. The routine was to make a low pass over the plant when we got there, so that they knew we were arriving. Then someone would drive over to the small runway and pick us up and take us to the plant. That low flyover was not near as scary as the landing. We came in very close to a row of trees, then just over the treetops we dropped down quickly to the narrow 1-lane, short landing strip. It may have been pretty routine for the pilot, but pretty scary for me as I watched right out the front windshield from my seat. Over the years I made many trips on that plane. There were several uneventful trips, but 1 or 2 that were memorable. One time we were sitting on the runway in Cleveland when a plane came in for an emergency landing. There were lots of fire trucks and emergency vehicles with lights flashing. The plane reported that its landing gear may not have been down, but it did have its wheels down, and it landed without a problem. One time my boss's boss and I were on the plane and coming into the Danville airport at night and in a big snowstorm. I had always heard that the pilots are going to come home on schedule, no matter what. As we approached the airport, Mr. Simmons and I were both on the edge of our seat with eyes glued out the windshield. The wind and snow were blowing hard across the runway and the plane was cocked at an angle to the landing strip. As we got lower and lower, my heart pounded harder and harder. Then, as the first wheel touched down, the pilot put the power on the other engine and the plane slowly turned to line up straight with the runway. Many thanks to the pilot for getting us home safely that night. A few years later, the plane was carrying our sales manager and his customer from Cleveland to Indianapolis Airport to drop off the customer. They had to make an emergency landing in a bean field 3 miles short of the airport. Everyone was okay, but the plane suffered quite a bit of damage. The story is that the fuel gauge had been broken for several months, and the pilots just calculated the fuel for each flight. When they were in Cleveland, they refueled, but the pilot never checked to see if the fuel actually got full. It didn't get full, and they ran out. The plane got repaired after that event and was sold shortly afterwards. Now on to the big projects. I got to be in the right place at the right time. In the early 70s, the computer systems were just beginning to expand out of the computer rooms and into the other offices of the company. I was put in charge as project manager for the company's first computerized sales order and shipping system that also tied into the accounting system. This was probably the biggest project that the company had undertaken. As it progressed, I moved to the computer department from the sales department, which was where I had been working. This became my full-time job. I really loved the work and put all the energy I had into it. I learned a lot as I went along about programming and accounting and many aspects of the company. I made a real name for myself with this project, with its implementation on time and with all the functions working and beyond expectations. As we brought the system online, I had to do much training for all the departments and plants. It was the first time that anyone in the company had used a computer terminal. These were CRT terminals called dumb terminals. They had a screen and keyboard, but all were attached to the central computer. They just were basically input devices. Can you believe we actually put a 5-second delay in the response time so people would not get used to an instant responses time? This project took me to the outlying plants for implementation and training. That is where the trips came in. At the time of these trips, Michelle was in school. Sometimes I was not home when there were events at school, and I really hated to miss them. Those are the drawbacks to work away from home. On the other hand, travel to far away and exciting places at the company's cost made memories for me that I'll never forget. One of those plants was located in Commerce, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. We implemented this plant in the winter, but out there it was like summer, which was very nice. I remember one trip where I left O'Hare when it was -5 degrees. When I arrived in LA that night, it was 80. The plant manager at the Commerce plant and I became good friends during those visits. I told him I planned to bring Michelle and Pat out on the next trip so we all could enjoy the LA area together. I told him that we would like to visit the Paramount Studios while we were there. Paramount was owned by Gulf Western, and so was Bone at that time. He wrote a letter to Paramount Studios telling them that a big executive from Bone was coming out to visit with his family and wanted to see the studios. Wow! He got a letter back from the head of the studio that said that a special tour had been set up for us. When we all got to LA, we went to the studio at the time and day they set up, and we met an old gentleman at the gate on a golf cart. The gentleman had been employed at the studio for many years, and he really knew his way around and a lot of history. He gave us the grand tour. Michelle was 10 and probably remembers this visit very well. She was as excited as me to be right in the middle of all the things that we had only seen on TV or in a movie. We got to walk right on the set where they did Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy, and Happy Days. And we got to see them shoot the opening scene of Star Trek, the motion picture. We even got to meet William Shatner. The tour guide is very kind to us and showed us many special areas and told us many stories about the studio. It was a special trip for sure. The final plant to bring into the system was Montreal. This was the most difficult to implement, but the city and nightlife made up for it. I had been to the plant a few times earlier, and one of those trips was in 1976. That is the year that the Summer Olympics was held in Montreal. I would stay in an apartment that we rented by the month for our employees to use when in town. It was right in the middle of town and in a high-rise building. When I was there, I did not need a rental car. It was very easy to walk a block down to the subway station where you could get to anywhere in the city. That subway system was wonderful. It was mostly underground and had rubber tires, which made it very quiet. There was a whole city at subway level. There wasn't anything you couldn't buy or do without ever getting up on ground level. There was a co-worker and friend that had transferred to the plant a year or so earlier. He was my private tour guide during my visits. He was a bachelor and took advantage of the very exciting nightlife around the city. These trips to Montreal were the only times that I found myself having very little sleep. At this time, discos were very popular. We would enjoy these spots, and one time we visited the Playboy Club. They had a great live band with a fantastic horn section. The nightlife was like no other place, but also the restaurants were wonderful. Of course, this entire city has a European flavor to it, and the main language is French. I have fond memories of some special dishes, like the French onion soup, a special seafood bowl with clams and shrimp, escargot, and the wine. All of this went on the expense account. I have to mention that I never had anyone question my expenses on any of my company trips. It was understood that anyone away from home on company business deserved special treatment for accommodations and meals. After we had fully implemented the sales project, I was given a promotion. I became part of the Gulf Western corporate staff out of Southfield, Michigan. I was given an office in the new building on 10 Mile Road, but I didn't have to move there. I had a nice big office in the Danville plant. They said I could travel out of Danville to do my various assignments just as well as out of Southfield. I did visit the corporate office once and saw my desk on the third floor with my nameplate on it overlooking the atrium in the center of the building. How crazy was that? During my work at corporate, I traveled a great deal. There were 60 some plants in the manufacturing division, and I think I visited over half of them. This is the period that I could have done without, except for the chance to see so much of this country. There were visits to plants in the Finger Lakes region of New York. There were trips to the plants in Kentucky and Mississippi, trips to the Rust Belt areas of Pennsylvania and Ohio. The company used IBM hardware and software exclusively. One of my missions was to identify where in the plants we could utilize these products to benefit the company. I attended several IBM classes to learn about the lots of things to help utilize their products. These classes were in places like New York City, Louisville, Chicago, and a couple of really cool locations. One of those that really stood out from the rest was the IBM Education Center in San Jose, California. 3 of us from my company attended a week-long session. The center was a huge complex with a large building with classrooms, then a golf course with orchards and housing. The condos were set out around the golf course, and that is where we stayed the nights. During some afternoons, we were free to sightsee. We had a rental car and drove up to San Francisco. We rode cable cars, toured the city, and had dinner at Fisherman's Wharf. I love this kind of free education. I also attended a 2-week-long class at Penn State and stayed at the Nittany Lion Inn. Another class was at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. The class in Chicago was on North Michigan Avenue, and I was there the day President Reagan was shot. The America's Cup races was something I knew very little about. In September 1980, I got to be right in the middle of this event. Through our association with IBM, I got to know a representative and worked with him on a big project in Salem, Ohio. Al owned a sailboat and he lived in New York. He sailed his yacht up to Newport, Rhode Island, and invited me and my boss to join him to watch the races. The event was called a project meeting for certain corporate reasons. Chuck Dawson and I traveled to Newport and attended a 15-minute meeting at Al's hotel and spent the rest of the trip having fun. We hopped on his yacht and sailed out to the race course for lunch and observing the race. The race was between the U.S. entry named Freedom, with Dennis Conner, and the defender of the cup was named Australia from Australia. The U.S. easily defeated the Aussies that day. Later that evening, we went to a very famous seafood restaurant across the bay. To get there, we went through Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, but it only took about 20 minutes. We were seated next to the Australian team and its millionaire backer, Mr. Bond. Although they had just been defeated, they were having a great time. I remember there were several buckets of champagne next to their large table. We were having whole lobster, which was a first for me. We were given bibs to wear and also instructions on how to tackle the lobster. This was a great business trip,